Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Leslie was completely shaken when Anita revealed the truth about Barbara's death. That revelation wasn't just another piece of family gossip, nor was it a random confession meant to sting. It landed like a thunderclap in Leslie's life, striking a nerve that had been buried under years of half-answers, unspoken resentments, and unresolved grief. Anita's words sliced through all the defenses Leslie had built to protect herself from the painful past. But the wound Anita opened was one that Leslie didn't expect to bleed so deeply. The news came not directly from Anita at first, but through a chilling whisper carried by Peaches. When Peaches told Leslie that her mother had taken her own life, unable to bear the weight of Anita's betrayal, Leslie's world tilted off its axis. To hear that Barbara, her mother, the one constant figure she thought she could trust, had ended her life because of someone else's deceit was not something Leslie could process easily. The grief was sharp, but what burned even more was the feeling of betrayal. Anita had always loomed like a dark, mysterious figure in Leslie's memory, someone tied up in secrets, power, and whispers of things never spoken aloud. Now, Peaches had handed Leslie what felt like the final proof: Anita wasn't just flawed, she was destructive. And in that moment, Leslie's heart hardened. Resentment quickly replaced sorrow. Every memory of her mother's suffering, every hollow look Barbara gave when she thought no one was watching, every lonely night Leslie remembered Barbara enduring it all became, in Leslie's mind, Anita's fault. Her anger wasn't fleeting. It wasn't the kind of rage that fades after a night's sleep. It settled in her bones like a vow, pushing her toward a decision that felt both cruel and justified. That act carried a twisted poetry to it, a sense of turning Anita's generosity into a dagger against her. Leslie didn't hesitate. In her grief-fueled logic, it was the only path forward. But just as Leslie steadied herself for the vengeance she thought she wanted, Anita dropped another revelation that shattered the ground beneath her feet again. Vernon, the man Leslie had grown up believing was her father, the man whose shadow had always loomed large even in his absence, was not her father at all. Dante, the man whose name was often cloaked in fear and disdain, was the one who had given her life. Anita revealed this truth with a mixture of hesitation and urgency, as though the secret had been eating her alive for years, and only now could it finally be spoken aloud. At first, Leslie laughed bitterly. How convenient, she thought. How easy for Anita to fabricate some shocking twist, some fabricated paternity swap, all to manipulate her into stepping back from revenge. The thought churned in her mind: Anita was lying again. This was all a trick. Another game played by a woman who had already stolen too much. Leslie's disbelief was fierce. She refused to accept that her entire understanding of who she was could be rewritten in one conversation. But Anita didn't back down. She brought forward evidence: photographs tucked away in boxes, letters never sent, documents that bore Dante's name where Vernon's should have been. Each piece cut deeper than the last, until Leslie's resistance began to crumble. The final blow came not from any paper or picture, but from Anita's eyes, haunted, raw, and filled with the torment of someone who had carried this burden alone for too long. For the first time, Leslie allowed herself to believe, and when she did, her tears broke free. She wept not as a woman hardened by grief, not as someone plotting revenge, but as a child lost, confused, desperate for a world that no longer existed. The cruelty of it all was unbearable. Her entire life, Leslie had lived under one truth, and now she was told it had been a lie. Dante wasn't just some name on paper. He was a figure who had orchestrated pain from the shadows, a man whose cruelty had rippled through generations. Leslie understood now why Barbara had seemed haunted, why Anita had lived with an invisible weight pressing her down. The truth was that Dante's darkness was the catalyst, the rot that had poisoned everything. Anita's story unfolded slowly, painting Dante not just as a negligent father but as a manipulative and destructive force. His shadow stretched over Barbara's despair, over Anita's silence, over Leslie's very identity. To realize that this man was her blood, that she was tied to him in a way she could never escape, was unbearable. The knowledge sank into her chest like a stone, suffocating her. It wasn't just about who her father was. It was about the decades of silence, the hidden wounds, the generations of women caught in Dante's web of cruelty. Leslie saw Anita differently in that moment. For so long, She had painted Anita as the villain of her story, the woman responsible for Barbara's death, the betrayer, the deceiver. But now she glimpsed the truth. Anita wasn't the orchestrator of Barbara's suffering but another victim of Dante's brutality. Anita's life had been defined by sacrifice and shame, by a silence that ate her alive. She had endured guilt, self-loathing, and accusations, all while bearing the weight of truths too dangerous to reveal. The realization tore Leslie apart. She had used Anita's own money to plot revenge against her, convinced that Anita was the enemy. She had hated her, cursed her name, and vowed to destroy her. Now, seeing Anita for what she truly was, Leslie felt the crushing guilt of her own misjudgment. She wasn't just wrong, she had become complicit in perpetuating the cycle of pain that Dante had set in motion. Desperation overwhelmed her. She thought of her mother's suffering, of the quiet moments where Barbara's grief had spilled through in small, almost invisible ways. She thought of the way Barbara's life had been cut short, leaving Leslie adrift. And now, to know that Dante was at the root of it all, that his cruelty had been the silent hand guiding so much misery, ignited a new kind of fury in her. It wasn't Anita she wanted to punish anymore. It was him. But how do you punish a man like Dante? How do you strike back at someone who thrives in shadows, who wears cruelty like armor, who has already destroyed so much? Leslie didn't have those answers yet. What she did know was that she would never forgive him. In her heart, Dante died that day. She erased him, declared him non-existent to her. He was not a father. He was nothing. Yet even with this declaration, Leslie was left hollow. Her identity had been upended, her loyalties rewritten, her hatred misdirected. In the wreckage, Anita remained broken, yes, but steady in her way. Anita did something Leslie never expected. She didn't cut off the trust. She didn't slam the door shut as punishment for Leslie's plotting. Instead, Anita promised to keep the money flowing, not as leverage, not as control, but as a gift, a gesture of reparation for all the wounds, all the scars, all the years of pain. This stunned Leslie. She didn't deserve it, not after the way she had treated Anita, not after her schemes. But Anita's offer was sincere, and in it, Leslie saw something she hadn't expected: hope. Perhaps not redemption, not yet, but the faint possibility of healing. Still, Leslie's path forward was uncertain. Every choice she made was colored by grief, rage, and regret. She couldn't stay in the same place, circling the same wounds. She had to make a choice, one that might mean stepping away from Anita, from the chaos, from the ghosts of Barbara and Dante. Only by leaving could she hope to reclaim some semblance of peace for herself, for her child, for the future she still barely believed she deserved. But leaving wasn't simple. To walk away meant facing a void, a silence she wasn't sure she could endure. To stay meant drowning in the endless reminders of betrayal, grief, and the cruelty of bloodlines. She hovered in that fragile space, torn between running and staying, between vengeance and forgiveness. And as she lingered there, the past refused to stay buried. Secrets don't just disappear, not when men like Dante are still alive to wield them like weapons. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. Leslie's heart remained heavy long after Anita's words sank into her soul. For the first time in years, she felt both clarity and torment. Clarity because the truth about her bloodline had finally been revealed. Torment because she realized the damage Dante had inflicted was irreparable. Every step she took in the aftermath felt weighted with decisions that were no longer hers alone. She carried her mother's memory, Anita's pain, and the burden of a past she hadn't asked to inherit. Anita, despite her own grief, chose a path of compassion. She didn't abandon Leslie even after knowing how close Leslie had come to turning the trust fund into a tool for revenge. Instead, Anita offered it freely, as though she believed Leslie could break the generational curse of bitterness. That choice spoke volumes about Anita's resilience. She had been branded the villain in Barbara's story, and even in Leslie's at first, but beneath the shadows and secrets was a woman who simply wanted to repair what had been broken, even if she could never undo the past. Yet Leslie couldn't shake the image of Dante's cruelty. The thought of him still walking freely, untouched by consequences, sent fire through her veins. He wasn't just a man who had failed as a father, he was a destroyer of lives. The more she thought of her mother's fate, the more she realized that silence would mean complicity. Dante had already erased Barbara, buried Anita under guilt, and twisted Leslie's sense of self until she was drowning in doubt and rage. To turn her back now would be to let his cruelty stand unchallenged. Still, she also understood that revenge wasn't simple. Dante was cunning, calculating, and merciless. He had built his life on manipulation, hiding behind lies and power plays. Leslie had already made one mistake by misdirecting her rage toward Anita. If she faced Dante with the same reckless fire, she would fall into the same trap. She needed strategy. She needed patience. Most of all, she needed to decide whether fighting him would truly set her free or whether it would drag her deeper into the darkness that had already consumed her family. Anita, in her quiet way, tried to guide Leslie toward a different path. She spoke not of revenge but of resilience, of reclaiming life from the ruins Dante had left behind. Anita confessed that she, too, had once dreamed of destroying him, but years of self-doubt and despair had shown her the futility of that path. Dante thrived on pain. To fight him on his terms was to give him exactly what he wanted. Anita urged Leslie to rise above him, to build something new that Dante couldn't touch. But Leslie's blood boiled every time she remembered her mother's suffering. Rising above sounded noble, but it felt impossible when the man responsible for Barbara's death still breathed. She lay awake at night imagining what Dante had said, what he had done, how he had twisted Barbara's spirit until the only escape she saw was death. Those thoughts hardened into resolve. Leslie might forgive Anita. She might even forgive herself. But she would never forgive him. The more she wrestled with her choice, the more her perspective on Anita shifted. The woman she had once despised became a figure of strange comfort. Anita's endurance was something Leslie had never understood before, but now she saw it clearly. It wasn't weakness, it was survival. Anita had borne the unbearable and still chosen compassion over destruction. That strength unsettled Leslie. It made her question whether she was capable of the same grace, or whether the rage she carried would consume her until she was nothing more than an echo of Dante himself. The tension between forgiveness and vengeance defined Leslie's every breath. She began to imagine two futures: one where she walked away, reclaiming peace for herself and her child, and another where she stood against Dante, no matter the cost. In both visions, Anita remained a constant, no longer an enemy but a witness to the choice Leslie would eventually make. Dante's presence, even in absence, was suffocating. Leslie couldn't escape the thought that he was out there, calculating his next move. If he had hidden the truth of her parentage for so long, what else had he buried? How many other lives had he destroyed in silence? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making her question whether her retreat would truly bring peace or simply leave Dante free to wreak more havoc. Anita, perhaps sensing the storm inside Leslie, offered her something unexpected: forgiveness. Not just for what Leslie had done, but for all the anger, all the mistakes, all the misguided blame. Anita told her that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain, but about releasing it before it poisoned her from the inside. Those words planted a seed Leslie didn't want to admit was growing. The trust fund remained untouched for weeks, a symbol of choice rather than obligation. Leslie would stare at the numbers, not thinking of money but of power to build a future or to fuel revenge. Anita's decision to keep it flowing without conditions was both a gift and a test. What Leslie chose to do with it would define the next chapter of her life. At times, she dreamed of leaving everything behind, packing up, disappearing, raising her child somewhere Dante's shadow couldn't reach. That vision tempted her. But at other times, she felt Barbara's presence pressing her forward, urging her not to let the truth remain buried. Each dream pulled her in opposite directions until she no longer knew which path was hers. The weight of legacy pressed hard on her. Barbara's pain, Anita's endurance, Dante's cruelty, all of it lived inside her now. She couldn't erase it. She could only decide how to carry it. Whether she would let it shape her into something destructive, or whether she could transform it into strength. As the days stretched on, Leslie came to realize that leaving wasn't just about escape. If she chose to walk away, it would be an act of defiance against Dante. It would mean refusing to let his cruelty dictate the rest of her life. But staying facing him might be the only way to bring true closure. That was the cruel paradox. Freedom and confrontation pulled her in opposite directions, yet both demanded to be chosen. Anita, scarred but unbroken, stood by quietly, ready to support whichever choice Leslie made. She didn't demand forgiveness. She didn't beg for reconciliation. She simply gave Leslie space, a rare gift after years of suffocating secrets. And in that space, Leslie found something she hadn't known she was searching for: the possibility of healing, fragile but real. The story was far from over. The truth had been unearthed, but its consequences were only beginning to ripple. Dante's shadow still loomed, and Leslie's decision lingered in the balance. Would she confront the man who had poisoned her family's history, or would she carve out a new future where his cruelty no longer held power over her? Whatever path she chose, the weight of Barbara's memory and Anita's compassion would guide her. And though she swore she would never forgive Dante, she also began to understand that true vengeance wasn't in destroying him, it was in surviving him. Leslie had reached the threshold of a decision that would either free her or chain her forever. The storms of the past had revealed their truth: her mother's despair, Anita's endurance, Dante's cruelty, and her own misplaced rage. But the future had yet to be claimed. She knew that silence would only let Dante's shadow linger, creeping into every corner of her life. Confrontation terrified her, but it also offered the chance to close the door on the pain that had defined her for too long. She imagined standing before Dante, looking into the eyes of the man who had orchestrated so much destruction. Would he deny it all, weaving new lies with the same silver tongue that had already broken her mother and silenced Anita? Or would he smirk, reveling in the suffering he caused, reminding her that cruelty was his only language? Leslie didn't expect contrition. Men like Dante didn't repent. But she wanted the truth to be spoken, to hear him admit to the role he had played, even if only to strip him of the power that thrived in silence. When the day came, Leslie carried Barbara with her. She didn't carry her mother's despair but her memory, her strength, the fragments of warmth that had once made Leslie feel safe before everything shattered. Anita's words also traveled with her, not as commands but as reminders that vengeance could consume as easily as it could empower. The trust fund remained untouched. It was not a weapon in her hands anymore but a tether to the idea that she could still build something beyond destruction. Facing Dante was like stepping into a mirror of darkness. His eyes held no warmth, only the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. For a moment, Leslie felt the weight of her bloodline pressing down, a cruel reminder that his cruelty ran in her veins too. But then she remembered the tears she had shed when Anita told her the truth, the sobs of a child unmade by lies. Those tears had not made her weak, they had made her human. She told him everything: about Barbara's pain, about Anita's years of silence, about her own rage and the poison it had carried. Her words were not accusations, they were truths, raw and undeniable. Dante laughed at first, dismissing her as emotional, fragile, unworthy of his time. But Leslie didn't flinch. She met his cruelty with clarity, stripping away his power with each word. She refused to let his dismissal define her. In the end, Dante offered no apology. He admitted nothing, denied everything, and cloaked himself in the same armor of arrogance that had shielded him for decades. But for Leslie, that was enough. She saw him for what he truly was: not a father, not a figure of power, but a hollow man whose only strength lay in the pain of others. His empire of cruelty collapsed in her eyes that day, and with it, the grip he had held over her. Walking away was harder than she expected. Her rage still screamed for justice, for punishment, for an ending that would make him feel even a fraction of what her mother had endured. But she remembered Anita's warning: revenge would never be enough. Dante thrived on the fire of others. To feed him her anger was to let him win. So she chose something harder. She chose to let go. When she returned to Anita, there was no grand declaration, no embrace that erased years of bitterness. There was only quiet acknowledgement, two women standing on the other side of truths that had nearly destroyed them. Leslie apologized again, not because Anita demanded it but because she needed to. Anita accepted, not because it fixed the past but because it allowed them to move forward. The trust fund became more than money, it became a bridge. Leslie accepted it not as payment, not as guilt, but as a chance to build the life her mother had never been able to. For her child, She would create something free of Dante's shadow, something that honored Barbara's memory without being defined by her pain. The ending was not one of perfect healing. The scars remained. Barbara's absence would always ache, Anita's silence would always sting, and Dante's cruelty would always echo in the corners of memory. But scars are not the same as open wounds. They are proof of survival, of endurance, of the ability to carry pain without being broken by it. In time, Leslie no longer spoke of Dante. He became nothing more than a ghost, stripped of power, erased from her story. She didn't forgive him. Some sins are beyond forgiveness, but she did outlive him, and that was its own form of victory. The cycle ended with her. Her child would not inherit Barbara's despair, Anita's silence, or Dante's cruelty. Instead, they would inherit resilience, compassion, and the strength to face hard truths without being destroyed by them. Leslie swore that was the legacy she would leave behind. The gates that once kept her trapped in bitterness and grief had finally opened, and beyond them, for the first time, lay the promise of peace.